Please welcome Ambassador Stuart E. Eizenstat, Chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us on this very important and solemn day. We have many special guests with us. First, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Austrian Federal Minister for Europe and the Constitution, Caroline Hetzstalder, who I had the pleasure of privately meeting a couple of days ago. She also addresses anti-Semitism in her portfolio. We're grateful to her and her government for their commitment to Holocaust education. I'd also like to acknowledge the several ambassadors with us today from Austria, Liechtenstein, Moldova, and Sweden, as well as our program participants, the ambassadors of Israel, Germany, France, and Poland, and members of the museum's governing council. A very special welcome to the high school students from the German International School of Washington who asked to be with us on this significant day. The fact that a younger generation wanted to join us is especially meaningful, and your presence means a great deal to us, symbolizing that the Holocaust will not be forgotten in the mists of history. And finally, and most especially, we welcome our real heroes, our cherished Holocaust survivors. Would you all please stand? You represent courage and resilience. International Holocaust Remembrance Day was first established by the United Nations General Assembly in 2005 so that the global community could come together to commemorate the Holocaust. The date marks the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945. Auschwitz has become a symbol worldwide of the systematic, industrialized effort to kill every Jew in Europe by Nazi Germany and its allies. We have never recovered our numbers. In 1939, before the invasion of Poland, there were 17 million Jews in a world of 1 billion. Today, there are only 14.7 million in a world of 8 billion. But more broadly, 2/3 of European Jewry, then the flower of Jewish culture and religion, were murdered, including 1.5 million children, never able to make their contribution to the world. The greatest genocide in history was also accompanied by the greatest theft of property and personal possessions in history, as the Nazis and their collaborators sought to eliminate all vestiges of Jewish life, root and branch. Along with Jews, millions of others, Poles, Slavs, Roma, and individuals with disabilities were also killed based upon a racial ideology that treated them as subhumans. Auschwitz was the ending, but today, and at critical moments like this, with a dangerous eruption of anti-Semitism worldwide, we must focus on beginnings. We have to ask ourselves, what was the path that led to Auschwitz? What did the world know about Auschwitz, and when did it know it? And most importantly, what were the warning signs that could have prevented the Holocaust, and how did people respond? These are enduring questions, questions this museum tries to answer, questions deeply relevant to our own times. We keep asking them and study the history of the Holocaust, not only to cherish the memory of those who perished and honor you who survived, but to learn lessons for the future, to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, and to heed warning signs of genocide in our own time. When we look at the failures of the past, we must ask hard questions about our own nation. During the Holocaust, President Roosevelt's action and inaction reflected widespread isolationism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia in the United States. Yes, our government's response was woefully too late, but in truth, Nazism needed to be stopped well before Germany plunged the world into war and genocide, which is why it's also worth recalling that 90 years ago this year, Hitler was still early in his regime, still solidifying his power, and German society still in the process of being Nazified. Radical anti-Semitism as state policy targeting Germany's tiny Jewish community was clear for all to see, and yet, most ominously, in 1934, Hitler, working within the German system, exploited events to become the absolute dictator of Germany, removing all previous legal and constitutional limits to his authority. That year, 1934, was 7 long years before the mass murder of Europe's Jews began. The warning signs were there long before an Auschwitz was even being contemplated. The Holocaust was not inevitable. Let me say that again. The Holocaust was not inevitable. Hitler's original goal was to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. He proceeded methodically, step by step, gradually disenfranchising German Jews and carefully gauging German and world reaction. And this is what he saw. No boycott of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, even though the 1935 Nuremberg laws and other discriminatory measures had already been passed. 1938 was a particularly fateful year when Hitler got clear signals of the world's indifference to the fate of the Jews. And he and his propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, said so publicly. The Anschluss with Austria, the Avian Conference, called by President Roosevelt to deal with the plight of German Jewish refugees, where the U.S. and other Western nations refused to lift rigid immigration quotas. Kristallnacht, the furious pogrom with mass violence and arrests nationwide, and the torching of 7,500 German Jewish businesses and 1,000 synagogues. None of these led to U.S. economic sanctions against Nazi Germany. The next year, 1939, over 900 German Jewish refugees on the SS St. Louis were denied entry to Miami Harbor. Later in the war, the U.S. Treasury Department, where I worked during the Clinton administration, presented Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. with an explosive report entitled "The Acquiescence of This Administration in the Genocide of the Jews." This led exactly 80 years ago this week, on January 22nd, 1944, to President Franklin Roosevelt, at last acting, issuing Executive Order 9417, creating the War Refugee Board, and announcing that it was now official U.S. policy to offer rescue and relief to the desperate Jews of Europe. However, by the time the War Refugee Board was established, over 4 million Jews had already been killed. While welcome, the War Refugee Board was created long after the U.S. government was aware of many early warning signs. FDR's executive order came 17 long months after Gerhard Riegner of the World Jewish Congress informed the State Department in 1942 of Germany's plan to annihilate Europe's Jews. By the time the State Department received Riegner's information, all 5 killing centers had already begun operation, and the Nazi genocide of the Jews was at its height. And the board was not created for more than a year after courageous Polish diplomat Jan Karski personally visited the president in the Oval Office on July 28, 1943, to provide his eyewitness account of the Nazi effort to wipe out Polish Jews, as he had secreted himself into the Warsaw Ghetto and went out to bear eyewitness. We recall these failures in order to remind us why the international commitment of never again is so vital. Never again for Jews, and never again for any group targeted for annihilation solely because of who they are. We recall these failures because we need to do more to live up to that commitment and to confront Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, which are rampant today, 2024, online, on campuses, and in cities worldwide. And especially at this moment, we recall these failures because the Holocaust reminds us that the desperate Jews of Europe had no safe haven. Nations around the world, including our own, as I mentioned, refused to let them in. It was out of this catastrophe that the world recognized the necessity of a Jewish state and the Jews' ancestral homeland, which went back thousands of years. For Holocaust survivors still reeling from the October 7th Hamas terror attack on Israel, the largest killing of Jews since World War II, along with over 200 hostages, including a Holocaust survivor. A Jewish homeland is something they never had when the world abandoned them. The guarantor of a Jewish future that the Nazis and their collaborators sought to prevent. That is why it's only fitting that we begin today's commemorative event with remarks from Israel's ambassador to the U.S., Michael Herzog. But before I invite Ambassador Herzog to the podium, I want to close on a personal and deeply important note. When I served as U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and the Clinton administration, I remember that my late wife Fran and I could always identify Jewish synagogues and institutions in the EU member states because they had armed guards outside, and we comforted ourselves that we could never have to worry about such attacks in the United States. I could never have imagined then that such measures would be commonplace in synagogues, day schools, community centers in the United States, and that Jews everywhere would feel threatened by violent hate. I also could never have imagined that Israel would shockingly be accused of genocide in an international courtroom, the International Court of Justice, as it seeks to defend its citizens from a deadly Hamas threat. And I'm grateful that our government has repeatedly stated that Israel has not committed genocide and that the South African case is, in their words, meritless, and that the German and French governments have also firmly rejected this accusation. This is an unimaginable affront to those we are here to honor today, the Holocaust victims and survivors. Having served in 6 presidential administrations, including my diplomatic post to the European Union, I always worked for and fervently hoped for peace in the Middle East. We know from Holocaust survivors that it's always children who suffer the most in wartime, and we mourn the loss of all innocent lives, Israeli and Palestinian. Now my distinct honor to welcome Ambassador Herzog, Israel's ambassador. He is a personal friend. He was appointed in 2021 as ambassador. He had a distinguished career as brigadier general in the IDF and has held senior positions in Israel's Ministry of Defense under 4 ministers of defense. Ambassador, it's a privilege to have you here, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you very much.
Dear Holocaust survivors, my dear friend, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, Ms. Sarah Bloomfield, Minister Ed Stadler, my dear colleagues from the Diplomatic Corps, and I especially want to acknowledge the ambassadors of Germany, Poland, and France for agreeing to speak here. Thank you very much for joining this event. Students, colleagues from our embassy, ladies and gentlemen. This is a solemn occasion of remembrance and of reflection. Anti-Semitism is one of the oldest and worst plagues of humanity. And we have a saying in Jewish tradition that in every generation there are those who rise to try and exterminate us. We recite it every year in Passover. And indeed, if you look at our history, that unfortunately is the case. The State of Israel was born a few years after World War II in the wake of the Holocaust that befell our people. And it was the expression, it was self-determination for the Jewish people after millennia. And it was also designed to provide refuge and a shelter for the Jewish people so that they can defend themselves and that nobody can ever exterminate the Jewish people. Yet what we see in modern times, one of the main modern incarnations of anti-Semitism is a targeting not only of the Jewish individual or a Jewish community, it is also the targeting of the Jewish state, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination and denying the Jewish state the right to self-defense. If we needed any reminder that this happens every generation, we got it on October 7th and ever since. We were attacked by an anti-Semitic genocidal organization, a massive invasion into the state of Israel, murdering, butchering, maiming, kidnapping people, including a Holocaust survivor, raping people. All of these are part of a scheme of genocide. Yet we, the State of Israel, are accused of carrying out genocide. How ironic. How ironic that the Genocide Convention, which was formulated immediately after World War II, in the wake of the Holocaust of our people, is now weaponized against the Jewish state. This really is ironic. And who takes us to court? South Africa, a country which is no longer Mandela's South Africa. It is a country that cooperates with the worst actors on the global scene. It is a country that espouses close relations with Iran. It is a country that supports Hamas, hosts Hamas post-October 7th, and it is a country characterized by a lot of anti-Semitism. Consider the recent deposition of the Jewish captain of South Africa cricket team. He was deposed because he's Jewish. And as Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt noted correctly, targeting or punishing a Jewish person for Israeli policies unrelated to that person, now that is anti-Semitism. We have seen an alarming rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th in this country, in Europe, and elsewhere. This is a real wake-up call, and we need to do much more, much more. And as far as I'm concerned, at the heart of what needs to be done stands education. And it starts and ends with education about the Holocaust, which is why this museum is so important. We need to educate about the Holocaust here in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. This is key to our efforts. Let me end on an optimistic note. If you look at Jewish history, the Jewish people always had this inner strength, the ability to rise from the ashes and build something new. and we should all draw strength from that. You, dear Holocaust survivors, are a testament to that you can rise from the ashes and build something new and provide hope for the next generation. So let us draw strength from that, from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Herzog. I think many of you know he comes from a distinguished family. His father was the president of Israel. His brother is the president now, and he's a wonderful representative of the state of Israel to the United States. We appreciate these important and moving remarks. It's now my pleasure to introduce Museum Director Sarah Bloomfield and other panelists, Ambassadors Marek Majorowski of Poland, Laurent Billy of France, and Andreas Michaelis of Germany. If you will please come up, and just let me say, as Sarah and all of you come up, that it's a privilege for me to work with Sarah day in and day out. She has devoted her life to this museum, and she and her staff have elevated it to new heights. We've had almost 50 million visitors since it was opened in 1993, and 90% are non-Jewish. Sarah, thank you, and you'll be moderating this panel, and thank you to our three ambassadors.
Thank you very much, Stu, and thank you, Ambassador Herzog, and especially to our panelists, all of whom I know well. It's been a privilege, gentlemen. I want to start with a question on what has already been referred to many times today, and this is this really shocking eruption of anti-Semitism worldwide since October 7th. And there have been some studies trying to analyze what are the stories, what are the narratives underneath this anti-Semitism? And there is one very, very prominent trend, which is anti-Semitic narratives about alleged Jewish conspiracies and Jewish global power, as exemplified in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You see here this fake publication written originally by the Russians in 1903 that has proliferated worldwide since then and to this very day. You can find it in probably any country in the world for sure, in any major city. So I wanted to start by asking our panelists, and this is a question for each of you, to give a frank assessment of what you see, what's the anti-Semitism you see in your own country since October 7th, and steps that you've taken to address it. And I'll start with Ambassador Margiewski of Poland.
Thank you so much. And let me first of all convey my deepest gratitude to Sarah personally and to the museum for this kind invitation and for this opportunity to address those vital questions today for all of us. Well, speaking of anti-Semitism in Poland, it's not easy, as you can imagine. I would make a very important distinction between what is going on social platforms, which is something we are so focused on nowadays, and what is going on in real life. In Poland, paradoxically, when you see all those verbal attacks on Jews, anti-Semitic incidents on social platforms, on Twitter, on Facebook, and Instagram, they very rarely translate into physical violence. They are disgusting, they are abhorrent, but actually, if you compare the situation in Poland and those waves, recurrent waves of anti-Semitism, which many other countries in Europe are also familiar with, they are actually incomparable with what is going on in many other countries. So we are, it might sound paradoxical and unfunny, but we are, for a certain, in a certain measure, privileged not to have to deal with instances of physical violence against Jews in Poland. And I will tell you quite frankly that Poland, and I think many of my Jewish friends here in the audience can corroborate this assertion, is one of the most secure places for Jews to visit nowadays. You can leave your hotel in Warsaw, in Gdańsk, in Krakow, take a peaceful stroll to the nearest synagogue, wearing your kippah, or even displaying your exuberant side locks, and nobody will even bother to recognize you as a Jew. Stuart mentioned those armed guards in front of many synagogues in Western Europe. We have no armed guards in Poland in front of our synagogues because we just don't need them. And on the final note, since you mentioned the conspiracy theories, which have become so popular, especially during the pandemic. So I will tell you that I was following all those accounts on Twitter and on other social platforms spreading rumors about Jews being, quote unquote, behind all those turbulences in the contemporary world. And believe me or not, after the Russian aggression against Ukraine almost 2 years ago, an overwhelming majority of those accounts and of those Twitter and Facebook users eagerly and very smoothly transitioned to pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian propaganda. I would just like to mention and highlight Putin's Russia interfering also and trying to meddle into European affairs and into American political life, trying to incite anti-Semitism in our societies.
Thank you. Ambassador Billy, I'd like to ask about France, and it's been certainly a different situation in France. Thank you.
Well, for France, it's a very special situation, as you say, because we are having the third largest Jewish community in the world, 500,000 of our citizens. And so it's a very sensitive subject. Obviously, after the 7th of October, we have observed a real impact on anti-Semitism acts. The numbers were around 4 times on the last trimester, the numbers of the previous year. So it has been a real impact. The reaction of, and well, I may say also on these acts, about 1,676. There is one interesting case which is really linked, one we could document it, that it has been financed from Russia to, and then publicized on the internet directly, so quickly after the event, some David Cross on some buildings in Paris that we could really see all the chain from the financing, the act, and the reporting. But there is also domestic dynamic, and on the domestic dynamic, we had obviously justice and police answers, starting by protecting local, of course, synagogue, schools, and also a wave of solidarity of our society and our political apparatus. We had a huge demonstration of 200,000 people in Paris, led by the Senate President and the National Assembly President, just to get that message about we don't accept anti-Semitism. And I think it was a very powerful demonstration and a very good message that we send.
Yes, I think the role of Russia and China is clearly behind stirring up a lot of this anti-Semitism, create a lot of chaos and discord in the West. Ambassador Michaelis, your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. I think it is very clear that from the German point of view, the country of the perpetrators, because the Holocaust is a crime committed by Germans in the German name, the fight against anti-Semitism has unique importance. However, unique importance also means we can't look away. We have to be very much up to the challenge we are facing. And up to the challenge in the German case today means that since 7th of October, the number of anti-Semitic crimes, and I speak of anti-Semitic crimes, not of anti-Semitic incidents, there are certainly far more, has quadrupled in Germany. So 4 times, and we are somewhere in the region of more than 5,000. So that is a very, very serious development, and it is something which requires of the government that we focus our authorities on fighting the phenomenon, that we focus the attention of our civil society on the phenomenon itself. And I would, with your permission, just distinguish two very important fields of work. One is, and we spend a lot of money on it, training teachers, training our police and security authorities to deal with the phenomenon at various levels. So that is one. But that even more important in a way is that we are not losing track. And that's why I'm very happy that I have a group of students, of pupils from the German school here, because what we need to achieve in Germany is that the youngest generation feels as much responsible to carry on with this fight against anti-Semitism as previous generations in post-war Germany. And for those of you who have followed it, I think it was very encouraging last weekend, because there is this second phenomenon, a right-wing extremist party that also has individuals in their ranks that embrace Nazi ideology, the AfD. This party polls at a level of 35% in Germany at the moment, and that is probably one of the most worrying developments. In Germany, we will hold state elections, so that's like state election, federal elections here in 3 states in September, and that will be the important test. But last weekend, more than 1 million Germans took to the street to clearly voice their opposition to this resurgence, at least partial resurgence of an ideology which needs to be absolutely rejected and which we need to fight.
Thank you. And it's interesting, you've all referred to education, and I just want to say that the museum has excellent partnerships with Germany, France, and Poland in Holocaust memory and education that have been going on for decades. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you all publicly. Now I want to show everybody this picture taken 30 years ago at the opening of the museum. And it's maybe a little hard to see, but you can see there are protesters holding up 2 signs. One says 6 million lies, and the other, we're sick of the Holocaust hoax. So my question for you is this: I'm sure you're well aware of free speech in the United States, something that gets a lot of debate these days. In America, this is legal. You can say these things. But Europe has taken a different approach to speech, particularly to the issue of Holocaust denial. And I wondered if you would each share the rules in your country, the laws and the policies on denial or hate speech more generally. You can relate this to social media policies that I've already brought up, but I think it's a very interesting topic we all face. Ambassador Magurski.
Well, quite intriguingly, in Poland, there are many anti-Semites, no need to deny that. I don't know how many, because I don't know the exact numbers and the exact statistics, but paradoxically, among those anti-Semites, there are very few Holocaust deniers. And I'll tell you why. Because many of those anti-Semites believe in conspiracy theories, namely those which blame Jews for orchestrating all the ills of the contemporary world. They say, for example, that, quote unquote, Jews largely benefit from the so-called Holocaust industry. So how can they be Holocaust deniers if they do believe that the Holocaust did happen and now Jews benefit from the Holocaust industry? So it is a very interesting distinction. And that's why, for example, there were very few, in recent years at least, there have been very few instances of trials and Holocaust deniers being convicted by Polish courts, because there is that gray zone between anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. I would say that those are 2 different matters, 2 different areas. So I think that this is a distinction we should make, especially in the case of Poland. And speaking of education, I believe that there is we should look at a wider picture. I mean, my apologies for being so insistent on the role of social media in today's world, but the social media have created an ambience, if you will, in which life should be easy. Now, sacrifice and empathy are difficult. Hatred is easy, especially if you are anonymous, especially if you are an anonymous user of Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And that's why I think that's why education is so crucial and so vital. But only if we look at a wider picture, which values are important, which values we should protect the most, and why hatred is still so easy to express and to display on social platforms.
Ambassador Billy, in the French situation?
Well, for us, anti-Semitism and the negation of the Holocaust, it's not an opinion, it's a criminal offense. Since 1990, in a context of resurgence of negationism, we have adopted a law, and so it's now a crime. And that law also encompasses other forms of discrimination. Another field has been, as you rightly say, dear colleague, the question of social networks and platforms. We have been part of different initiatives to encourage a platform to moderate the contents and to fight all these hatred speeches on platforms. So there is a Christchurch school with New Zealand that we launched, where it's Tech for Good with different CEOs, and it's an ongoing work because it's challenging juridically, but we really think that it's one of the frontiers on which we have to work to fight anti-Semitism.
Thank you. And Ambassador Michaelis, the German situation?
Yeah, in our case, denying the Holocaust is a criminal offense. Displaying the symbols of the National Socialist Movement and Party is a criminal offense. And I think everybody will understand that in the case of our country, we decided to move into that direction. But additionally, I think what we need to see is that we try to complement our legislation. For instance, we introduced a special provision into our criminal law, which specifies that if a certain crime is carried out and it is carried out with an anti-Semitic intention and objective, that is then called aggravating circumstances that can be assessed by the court that is dealing with a case. We have also, because we had so many cases where groups in the country suddenly burn flags, and especially then because it's only one step from homegrown and home-focused anti-Semitism to then attack the state of Israel. So we didn't want to see Israeli flags being burned on the occasion of these demonstrations. So we added a special provision that deals with the desecration of national flags. And last remark, I think that's very important for all of us because all three countries are members of the European Union. There will be a new legislation that will take effect, which is the Digital Services Act. Sounds very technical, but it's very important because that is a legislation that creates special responsibilities for the providers of digital services in the European Union to make sure that incitement, hate speech, etc., is not part of the content, and that new legislation will enter into force in a few days, and I think it will be a very important instrument that will also be used in the context of fighting anti-Semitism.
Well, we're very gratified to see the European Union continuing to take up these important issues. I'd now like to ask a final question of each of you. I'll start with Ambassador Mogorowski, a question about Poland, where you've had a long-standing, very strong commitment to preserving the killing centers, such as Auschwitz that we see here, that were built by the Germans in occupied Poland. And I know visiting these sites is a part of Polish educational efforts for all young students. But I also understand that you're taking on some new educational reforms soon. And I wondered if you could reflect on, will there be some additional enhancements to Holocaust education with these new reforms?
In Poland, it is very difficult to talk about the true facet, if you will, of the Holocaust during communist times, because under Soviet rule, it was preferable to talk about the suffering of Poles and Russians and Ukrainians and, well, so the Soviet nations than the Jews. It was used for political purposes. Now, in 1989, with the transformation and with the transition from communism to democracy, we had to change the narrative. And it has been a very painful and a very arduous process, which has not actually concluded yet. So, for example, when I talk I'm the former Polish ambassador to Israel, and we spent 3 wonderful years there from 18 to 21, and I frequently talk with my wife about what we learned as teenagers in Polish schools about the Holocaust, and the knowledge we acquired in Polish schools in the 70s and in the 80s was very scarce, was very insufficient in terms of our approach to the Jewish suffering in that period. So many elderly Poles are still convinced that it was us who were the main victims of that murderous endeavor of German Nazis and not Jews. We are still struggling to persuade many Poles, especially elderly, that more than 95% of those who were exterminated in this death camp in Auschwitz were of Jewish descent and not Polish. On the other hand, there is also that distorted view that Poles did not suffer during the Holocaust. And again, another anecdote, some of my American friends, where we were telling them stories of Poles being also slaughtered massively by Germans during the war, they were surprised because they were absolutely convinced that it was only the Jews who were exterminated by Germans during World War II. So there are those nuances which are so important in terms of our domestic education, but also with regard to the that exposition of the Jewish suffering and the Polish suffering during the war beyond Poland.
Yes, and it's the museum has a full academic center devoted to ensuring that Holocaust scholarship is at the highest level and that the truth of the Holocaust is clear everywhere in Poland and other countries. And Poland has and is in the process of going through a very important transition, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on that. Ambassador Beeley, I wanted to move to a slightly different topic. Here we see a very iconic image of the Holocaust with Jews arriving at Auschwitz. They will soon be gassed. And I'm showing this today because France has weighed in on the situation at the International Court of Justice and its shocking case that's before it, that stated, I think France stated, to accuse the Jewish state of genocide is to cross a moral threshold. It's a statement from France. Would you please comment on why it was important for your government to do this?
Well, in fact, we do think that word matters, and that a concept, the one of genocide, couldn't be abused to make a point or lightly, let me say, or to make a political point. And I think in that particular place, it's I don't need too long explanation for the rationale behind our position. We, at the same time that we fully support the right of Israel to defend itself, and we, after the horrific terrorist attack, we also recall that the need to respect international humanitarian law, and so to try to minimize civilian casualties, which includes access of humanitarian help to civilian population. We were development today, the French government will study and the court provisory statement, and we will see how we are going to react or participate. But again, I think our main point is really the gravity of the concept, the question of the political intent, and I think it's a very important moment.
And Ambassador Michaelis, Germany actually made a very strong statement saying that you would intervene as a third party in this case against Israel, something that was quite an impressive statement.
Yes, and also against the backdrop of the provisional ruling that was published by the court, I can confirm we will do that in the next step that is taken by the court, because we are clearly convinced that we are not looking at a genocide that, to speak in more legal context, the convention requires that there is genocidal intent, and that is something that does not apply at all. We look at Israel. Israel is acting in self-defense in this situation. And of course, because that is something which also the Israeli government understands, when we engage in dialogue, when we speak about the situation in Gaza, we would as much, advocate humanitarian access. And of course, humanitarian international law needs to be respected with regard to the civilian population. But it is a big step from the harsh and, with regard to the civilian population, highly challenging situation in the Gaza Strip, to putting that story into the context of a genocidal activity. And I think, as I've said, that is something that we will state very, very clearly. I think sometimes, yesterday, for instance, and Ambassador Herzog also attended that event, we attended a memorial service of the Kissinger family for Henry Kissinger in New York. And as we approached the synagogue, there was a group of protesters, of demonstrators in front of it, with big signs saying, "No genocide in Gaza." And we just passed, we went into the synagogue, and it was a very, very moving service for this man who was born in Germany and had to flee the country and became a great American. Now, afterwards, I asked myself, maybe as the German ambassador, I should have gone to these people and said that I represent the country that has committed a genocide. And on that basis, I may have some idea what is involved in this. But that what you are looking at when you look at Gaza and the military confrontation is certainly not a genocide. I somehow regretted that I had not done it, in spite of the fact that you don't know whether you can really have a dialogue with these people. But that's how it translates into everyday reality. That's why I think it's really required to push back where you need to push back, and that is what my government, acting here also within the historical responsibility, is trying to do.
That's a great conclusion to our panel. I just want to thank all of our panelists for talking about these vitally important messages and for your commitment to Holocaust education, memory, and to truth, and to understanding the very important moral questions that face us today. I want to introduce Carolina Stadler, the Austrian Federal Minister for the European Union and Constitution, and coordinator for their work on addressing anti-Semitism. Minister, please join us.
Thank you so much, dear Director Blumenfeld. dear Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, Excellencies, here on stage and in the audience, ladies and gentlemen, but first and foremost, dear students and dear esteemed survivors of the Holocaust, I'm admiring your strength, your power, and your presence today here. I myself stand before you today with a profound feeling of responsibility, representing Austria, a country that has evolved, learning of its history. A country that has become a frontrunner in the fight against anti-Semitism within the European Union. Today, we collectively address the pressing issue of the globally rising anti-Semitism, especially since the barbaric attack of Hamas against Israeli people on October 7th last year. Pictures of the darkest chapters of our history came to our minds when we saw fighters of the terrorist organization groups attacking, torturing, raping, kidnapping, and killing innocent civilians. Pictures of the darkest chapters of our history came also to my mind when I saw people on the streets in Europe protesting against Israel, proclaiming expressions like "from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free," which means nothing else than erasing Israel off the map and denying its right of self-defense. Israel, a country which recently celebrated its 75th birthday. Israel, a country which has been found as a promise for Jews all over the world to have a safe haven. The security of Israel and the Jewish people is not negotiable to us. For Austria, it's a raison d'etat, and for me, it is also a driving force in my political life. Ladies and gentlemen, if the Jews in Europe, if the Jews in the world are under pressure, our free democracies and our societies are under pressure. That's why we developed the Austrian National Strategy against Anti-Semitism. That's why we passed the Austrian Jewish Cultural Heritage Act in Austria. That's why we inaugurated the walls of Names Memorial in the heart of Vienna. There, the names of more than 64,000 murdered Jewish children, men, and women are engraved in stone to give them back at least their names and part of their dignity. And we created a vivid place for commemoration, a place where descendants can think of their fathers, mothers, grandfathers, and grandmothers. And of course, and I would reflect to the panel, we do have armed forces in front of synagogues and schools, in front of Jewish institutions, because we cannot rely in God alone. We have to secure the Jews in our country. To be successful in combating anti-Semitism, we have to include the whole society and encourage them to stand up against all forms of hatred and intolerance. And in this context, the Austrian government has focused on reaching out to all societal levels, introducing Holocaust education, not only in our schools, but also in the curricula of civil servants, such as the police, military, and justice system, and also within the context of integration of immigrants. Education is not only about preserving historical fact, it is about instilling empathy, fostering critical thinking, and building bridges between communities in our nations. I would like to thank you, dear Director and dear Ambassador Eizenstat, for the great work you are doing here in this wonderful museum and engaging especially with young people. And we are also looking back to a long-standing cooperation with your house, with the so-called Gedenkdiener. They are serving their as memorial servants here. Let us join hands in this collective effort to combat anti-Semitism globally. Let us shape a world where never again is not an empty phrase, but reality. I'm fully aware that no matter what measures we take, be it restitution or granting the Austrian citizenship to descendants, we cannot make up for the atrocities committed by Austrians during the Nazi regime. What I can promise you, however, is that we will always do everything we can to combat all forms of anti-Semitism, also in order to secure our free democracies and societies. Shalom, Am Israel Chai.
And now, to close our program, it's my great honor to invite one of the 40 Holocaust survivors who volunteer at the museum and do so much to advance our mission. Please join me in welcoming Irene Weiss, whom you see here in the same photograph you saw before. Here she is as a young girl, just having arrived at Auschwitz. Please welcome Irene.
Thank you for asking me to make a few remarks today. I lived in a small town in Czechoslovakia with my parents and 6 children. There were 10 Jewish families out of approximately 2,000 people living there. Everything changed when the Hungarian government occupied that part of Czechoslovakia in 1939. Anti-Semitism was unleashed and the law no longer protected us. The other passengers, sorry. One memory that stays with me is a train ride that I took with my father from a neighboring town to our home village. As the train was leaving the station, 2 young guys approached our seat and started laughing, pointing to my father, saying, "What should we do with this Jew?" They began to taunt and discuss how much fun it would be to throw my father off the train. The other passengers turned away and did nothing. As their threats became louder and they got closer to him, I was terrified. I could see out the window that we were arriving to our stop. Only our arrival prevented these thugs from throwing my father off the train. We got off the train and went home without saying a word to each other. My father never took a train again. Other restrictions and persecutions followed. Businesses were confiscated, Jews were not allowed to attend school, professionals lost their licenses, and our Jewish young men were ordered into labor brigades. Soon after, all Jews were deported to ghettos and death camps. I was 13 years old. Again, everyone was silent. Upon arriving in Auschwitz in May 1944, my parents, 4 young siblings, were murdered. My older sister and I were selected for slave labor. When I was a child in Auschwitz, I was certain that when the killing was over and the world found out about what had happened there, there would never be any anti-Semitism again. We know that isn't true. Can you imagine how it feels at my age to think that my children and grandchildren don't feel safe today to identify as Jews, and that the very existence of Israel is threatened? The survivors depend on you to learn the history of the Holocaust and the facts about the history of Israel. We count on you to be our allies and speak out against anti-Semitism and hatred, and to learn from the Holocaust the consequences of being silent, like those passengers who looked away when the thugs humiliated and taunted my father on the train. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Irene, for these powerful reflections and for all you and other survivors do to advance Holocaust education and combat anti-Semitism. May I just say on a personal note that in the Clinton administration in 2000, I was part of a negotiation with Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson, and we created the first International Holocaust Education Working Group through the Stockholm Declaration. That's now changed into the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance with 35 nations, including the countries represented here, and Austria and Sweden and others. It's never been more important to promote Holocaust education worldwide, not just to look back, and I say this to the students, not just to look back, but to learn the lessons of what happens when intolerance and hatred go unchecked, when, as Irene mentioned, harassment occurs and people, good people, do nothing. That's the lessons that we try to impart. Thank you all for joining us today. Please remain in your seats while our survivors and ambassadors join me in the Hall of Remembrance. I look forward to seeing all of you there. Thank you for coming.